German Shepherd freezes with two puppies, a story that will blow your mind. What happens in the middle of this story completely changes the ending. We'd love to know which city you're watching this video from, so feel free to drop a comment below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with all our content. The storm raged outside, each gust of wind rattling Jack's small cabin as if testing its resolve against nature's fury. Snow had piled high against the windows, transforming his secluded haven into an icy fortress. Jack, a retired firefighter, had come to value this isolation. After decades of chaos and saving lives, the quiet was a balm for his soul, even if it bordered on loneliness. That night, as he sat near the crackling fire, the warmth from the flames barely cutting through the chill that crept in from every corner, he savored his solitude. A steaming mug of coffee rested in his hands, its aroma mingling with the faint scent of burning pine logs. The only sound was the rhythmic popping of the firewood, a comforting melody in the silence of his mountain retreat. Suddenly, a faint scratching interrupted the quiet, a tentative sound, almost drowned by the howling wind. Jack froze, his senses sharpened by years of responding to emergencies. The scratching came again, followed by a low, desperate whine. Probably just the wind, he muttered, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. He rose slowly, his joints stiff from age and the cold. Grabbing his flashlight and an old hunting knife from the table, a habit born of caution, he approached the door. As he unlatched it, a blast of icy air surged inside, biting at his exposed skin. Jack squinted against the snow swirling in the wind, his flashlight piercing the darkness. Then he saw them. A German Shepherd stood at the threshold, her coat dusted with snow and her body trembling from the cold. She stood protectively over two tiny pups, both shivering and huddling close to her. The mother's eyes met Jack's, deep brown and filled with a mixture of fear and pleading. She pressed herself closer to her pups, as if shielding them from an unseen danger. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen another living soul in weeks, and now, here was this fragile family, on the brink of collapse. "Hey there," Jack said softly, his voice barely audible over the storm. He knelt to make himself less intimidating, extending a hand cautiously. The mother dog bared her teeth slightly, a warning growl rumbling in her chest. Jack didn't flinch, his instincts telling him that she was more scared than hostile. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he murmured. He rose and stepped back into the cabin, leaving the door open as an invitation. The dog hesitated, her body tense and eyes darting between Jack and the warmth inside. She nudged her pups forward first, ensuring their safety before she cautiously stepped in after them. Jack quickly shut the door behind them, blocking out the biting wind. He grabbed an old blanket from the couch and gently draped it over the mother and her pups. She growled softly at first but soon settled, her body visibly relaxing as the warmth seeped in. "You're safe now," Jack said, his tone as comforting as he could manage. He fetched a bowl of water and some leftover chicken from the fridge, warming it over the fire. The mother wolfed down the food, her hunger overcoming her wariness. The pups, too weak to eat, snuggled closer to her belly, seeking comfort and warmth. As the night wore on, Jack couldn't help but study the trio. The mother was lean, her ribs faintly visible beneath her coat, and her body bore scars that spoke of a hard life. The pups, though tiny and frail, had an undeniable spirit in their eyes. "What brought you here?" Jack wondered aloud, his voice filled with curiosity. The dog's ears perked slightly at the sound of his voice, though her eyes remained guarded. As he sat back in his chair, the firelight danced on the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to flicker with life. Jack realized that, for the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The fragile family before him brought a warmth that even the fire couldn't match, a spark of purpose in his otherwise solitary existence. The storm raged on through the night, its relentless howl a reminder of nature's raw power. Inside the cabin, however, a fragile peace had settled. Jack sat by the fire, watching as the German Shepherd and her pups huddled together under the old blanket he had given them. Their breathing had steadied, the warmth of the room slowly reviving their frail bodies. Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy for them. The mother, though exhausted, remained alert, her eyes never leaving him. She was a survivor, he could see it in the way she positioned herself between her pups and the rest of the room, always ready to protect them. "Don't worry," Jack said softly, breaking the silence. "I'm not going to hurt you." He wasn't sure if she understood his words, but something in his tone seemed to reach her. Her ears flicked slightly, though she kept her wary gaze on him. He leaned back in his chair, the familiar creak of the wood echoing in the small space. His mind drifted to memories he had tried to leave behind. As a firefighter, he had often encountered animals in distress, trapped pets, injured wildlife, but this felt different. These dogs weren't just lost or abandoned, they had chosen his cabin, braving the storm to reach him. The thought unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. When dawn broke, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Snow piled against the windows, creating a soft glow that illuminated the cabin's interior. Jack busied himself with chores, giving the dogs space to adjust. He prepared a hearty breakfast of eggs and toast for himself, setting aside a portion of scrambled eggs for the mother dog. She sniffed at the offering cautiously before devouring it, her hunger overriding her suspicion. "I guess you've had it rough," Jack muttered as he watched her eat. The pups, still too small to eat solid food, continued to nestle against their mother. Jack noticed that one of them, a smaller, runty pup with a patch of white fur on its chest, seemed weaker than the others. It shivered even under the warmth of the blanket, its tiny frame heaving with labored breaths. Concerned, Jack crouched down near the blanket, moving slowly to avoid alarming the mother. "Easy," he said, holding his hands up. She growled softly but didn't move as he reached for the struggling pup. He lifted it gently, feeling its fragile body tremble in his hands. "You're not doing too good, huh?" Jack said, his voice tinged with worry. He fetched a clean towel and warmed it near the fire before wrapping the pup snugly. The mother watched him intently, her gaze a mixture of suspicion and desperation. As the day wore on, Jack tried to assess the family's condition. He knew the mother needed medical attention, her paw was swollen and she limped when she moved, a sign of an injury that hadn't healed properly. The pups, though sheltered and fed now, were still vulnerable to the cold and malnutrition. He found himself wondering how far they had traveled and what they had endured to reach his cabin. "Looks like I've got my work cut out for me," Jack said to himself, his voice filling the otherwise quiet cabin. He hadn't planned on taking care of anyone, animal or human, but now he felt an unshakable sense of responsibility for the fragile lives under his roof. That night, as the wind howled outside, Jack sat by the fire, the smallest pup cradled in his hands. The mother lay nearby, her head resting on her paws as her wary eyes followed his every move. "You're stronger than you look," Jack said, addressing her. "But you're not alone anymore. We'll figure this out." For the first time, the mother seemed to relax. She let out a long sigh and rested her head fully on the blanket, her trust in Jack beginning to outweigh her fear. The smallest pup, now wrapped in the warm towel, stirred slightly and let out a faint whimper. Jack smiled faintly. "That's it, kid. Keep fighting." As he sat there, the storm raging on outside, Jack realized that his once quiet cabin had become a haven, a fragile sanctuary for the unexpected visitors who had somehow given him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The blizzard continued into the third day, its fury unrelenting. The cabin was now buried up to the windows in snow, and the world outside had disappeared into a white abyss. Jack stood by the small kitchen window, his breath fogging the glass as he surveyed the desolate scene. It was as if the storm had swallowed the world whole, leaving only his tiny cabin as a beacon of life. Behind him, the soft sounds of the mother dog grooming her pups filled the room. It was a rhythmic, soothing sound, punctuated by the occasional faint squeak from the pups as they wriggled closer to her warmth. Jack glanced back and noticed the smallest pup, the runt he had wrapped in a towel the night before, beginning to stir. Its tiny legs flailed weakly, a sign that it was regaining some strength. "Well, you're a fighter," Jack said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He crouched down near the makeshift bed he had made for them by the fire. The mother dog raised her head, her sharp eyes locking onto his every move. Though her body remained tense, her growl was absent this time. Jack reached for the bowl of warmed broth he had prepared. He had diluted some leftover chicken soup, hoping it would be gentle enough for the pups to handle. "Here," he said softly, dipping a spoon into the broth and offering it to the mother first. She sniffed it hesitantly before lapping it up, her eyes flicking between the bowl and Jack. "Good girl," Jack murmured. "See? We're figuring each other out." Once she had finished, he turned his attention to the runt. The tiny pup looked fragile in a way that tugged at Jack's heart, a soft reminder of the fragility of life he had witnessed so many times in his career. He dipped a finger into the broth and brought it to the pup's mouth. At first, there was no reaction, but then a small tongue darted out, licking the liquid. "There you go," Jack whispered. "One step at a time." As the pup took more, Jack felt a strange sense of relief, as if its small victory was his own. He caught the mother dog watching him, her expression softer now, though still guarded. Her trust, Jack realized, would come in increments, each one hard one but deeply rewarding. Later that afternoon, Jack decided to examine the mother's injured paw more closely. She had been favoring it, barely letting it touch the ground, and he knew it couldn't wait much longer. He approached her slowly, speaking in a low, calming voice. "I need to take a look at that paw," he said, crouching a safe distance away. The mother tensed, her body coiled as if ready to defend herself. Jack waited, giving her time to adjust to his presence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of jerky, holding it out as a peace offering. Her nose twitched, and after a long moment, she leaned forward, taking the treat gingerly from his hand. "That's it," Jack said softly. "Now let me help you." He reached for her paw, moving with deliberate slowness. She growled low in her throat, but as Jack gently cradled her paw, the growl subsided into a quiet whimper. The sight made his stomach tighten. Her pads were cracked and raw, and one of her claws was torn, the wound angry and swollen. "You've been through hell," Jack muttered. He fetched his first aid kit from the shelf, grateful for the training he'd received during his firefighting days. He cleaned the wound carefully, his hands steady despite the mother's occasional flinch. As he wrapped her paw in a clean bandage, she let out a soft sigh, her body relaxing slightly. "There," Jack said. "That's a start." By the time evening fell, the cabin had taken on a new rhythm. The mother dog lay by the fire, her bandaged paw tucked beneath her. The pup slept soundly beside her, their tiny bodies rising and falling in peaceful unison. Jack sat in his chair, sipping a fresh cup of coffee and marveling at how much had changed in just a few days. The storm outside held on, but inside, there was warmth and life, a fragile but undeniable connection forming between Jack and his unexpected guests. The snow had begun to slow by the fourth day, but the sky remained heavy with clouds, a constant reminder that the storm hadn't truly relented. The landscape outside still seemed lost beneath a thick veil of white, with the wind occasionally kicking up to send a swirl of snow against the windows. Inside, the atmosphere had changed since the mother dog and her pups had arrived. What had once been a cold, solitary cabin now felt more alive, more purposeful. The air was thick with the quiet hum of shared existence, of an unexpected bond between a man and the creatures he never intended to take in. Jack was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, staring out the window as he tried to gather his thoughts. The past few days had been a whirlwind of care, feeding the pups, tending to the mother's injury, cleaning up after the small family, and slowly making progress on their recovery. He'd never expected his quiet retreat to be interrupted so thoroughly. Yet, despite the chaos they had brought, Jack couldn't ignore the stirrings of something deeper within him, something he hadn't felt in years. The fire crackled softly in the background, the flames licking at the wood as the heat spread across the room. Jack looked over at the trio resting near the hearth. The mother dog had curled up next to her pups, their tiny bodies huddled close to hers for warmth. Her alert eyes, once filled with fear and suspicion, had softened. She had started to trust him, and in return, he'd learned to trust her silent strength. As Jack stood to check on them, he noticed the smaller pup, the one he had been most concerned about, stirring. It had grown a bit stronger in the last day, though its breathing was still shallow. Jack knelt next to the small bundle of fur and, in one smooth motion, scooped the pup up carefully into his hands. The little creature didn't whimper this time, but rather nuzzled its tiny face against his palm, seeking comfort in the warmth of his touch. "You're a tough one, huh?" Jack murmured, gently rubbing the pup's back. He'd been watching for signs of improvement, and there were small victories. More movement, more energy. But the pup still needed help, a lot of it. The mother watched him with a new wariness, but it wasn't as sharp as before. There was something different in her gaze now. She had begun to understand that Jack wasn't a threat, but someone who would take care of her family. While Jack focused on the pup, he noticed the mother subtly shifting in her sleep. Her eyes never closed entirely, always flicking back to him, but now there was less tension in her posture, a softer, almost trusting stance. It was small, but it was enough to make Jack feel the weight of their fragile bond. "I'll keep you safe," Jack promised under his breath, though he wasn't sure if it was for her sake or his own. A part of him had begun to feel a connection to them that went beyond simple obligation. He had spent his life saving others, putting himself in danger for the sake of strangers, but now he felt something deeper, a pull to protect, to nurture, even in this remote place, so far from his old life. Later in the day, after ensuring the pups were fed and the mother's paw was checked, Jack decided to venture out into the storm. He needed more supplies, and the storm had abated enough to allow a brief window for travel. He bundled up in thick layers, donned his heavy boots, and grabbed his old hunting rifle, a precaution more than anything. His hand rested on the door handle, but before he stepped outside, he turned back to look at the dogs. The mother's eyes were on him again, full of questions and yet trust. For the first time since their arrival, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just for their survival, but for their future. If he was going to take them in, he needed to do more than just provide food and shelter. He needed to offer them something permanent, something beyond this storm. "Stay safe," Jack said, and the mother gave a soft, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes softening as if to say, "I trust you now." Jack stepped outside into the biting cold, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him. The wind cut through his coat, but there was a strange sense of purpose in his every step. The world beyond his cabin was silent, save for the occasional gust of wind howling down the mountain, but Jack felt as if he had taken the first step on a new path, a path he hadn't planned on but would now follow through to the end. As he trudged through the snow, his thoughts turned back to the dogs. He couldn't imagine what they had been through to end up here, stranded in the storm, but he knew one thing for sure: they weren't just animals anymore. They were family, and Jack had no intention of abandoning them. The biting cold outside was relentless as Jack trudged through the thick snow. The wind howled around him, sending sharp flakes biting at his face. His heavy boots crunched loudly with every step, breaking the eerie silence of the snow-laden wilderness. Jack's destination was a small outpost about 3 miles down the ridge, a survival shack left over from his firefighting days, stocked with emergency supplies for situations like this. He had often relied on it during the harsh winters, but this time, the trip felt different. The weight of responsibility for the dogs pressed on him, a quiet determination driving each step. As he rounded a bend in the trail, he spotted the weathered structure in the distance, half buried under a thick blanket of snow. The small shack, constructed of rough-hewn logs and metal sheeting, stood resilient against the elements. Jack quickened his pace, his breath fogging the icy air, his mind racing through a mental inventory of what he hoped to find: food, blankets, maybe even something to better treat the mother dog's injured paw. Reaching the shack, Jack forced the frozen door open with his shoulder, sending a spray of snow onto the wooden floor. The inside was dim and musty, but it was a treasure trove of essentials. Shelves lined the walls, holding canned goods, bottled water, and basic medical supplies. In one corner, a small stack of firewood rested next to a rusted but functional kerosene lantern. Jack lit the lantern, its warm glow illuminating the cramped space. As he began to gather supplies, Jack's thoughts wandered back to the dogs. He had already started thinking of names for the pups, though he hadn't settled on any yet. The mother dog, however, had begun to feel like a steadfast guardian, strong, resilient, and fiercely protective. Guardian, he muttered to himself, testing the name aloud. It felt fitting. While rummaging through a storage chest, Jack's hand brushed against something unexpected, a metal box, slightly corroded, with a latch that resisted his attempts to open it. His curiosity piqued, Jack brought the box into the light of the lantern and pried it open with his pocket knife. Inside was a collection of old maps, yellowed and brittle, along with a leather-bound notebook. The notebook was worn, its cover scuffed, but the pages inside were meticulously filled with notes, sketches, and coordinates. As Jack flipped through it, he realized it was a journal, one that seemed to belong to a hiker or someone who had spent a lot of time in the wilderness. The entries described routes through the mountains, encounters with wildlife, and mentions of strange noises and unusual sightings. One page in particular caught his eye, a sketch of a large dog, strikingly similar to the mother he had taken in. His heart skipped a beat as he read the accompanying entry: spotted a German shepherd with 2 pups near the northern ridge. Appeared malnourished but evasive. Left food but couldn't get close. Will try again tomorrow. The date was just a week old. Jack's mind raced. Someone else had encountered these dogs, and recently. But who? And why hadn't they returned for them? The sound of a faint creak outside jolted him back to the present. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Peering through the small frosted window, he saw nothing but snow and shadows. Yet, the feeling of being watched prickled at the back of his neck. He quickly packed the supplies into his bag, tucking the journal and maps into an inner pocket. Before leaving, he secured the shack, ensuring everything was in its place. The trek back to the cabin was slower, the weight of the supplies making each step more laborious. Jack's thoughts swirled with questions. Who had written the journal? Could they have been searching for the dogs? And if so, why had they abandoned the search? As the cabin came into view, Jack felt an unexpected rush of relief. The soft glow of the firelight through the window was a beacon of safety, a reminder of the lives now depending on him. When he entered, shaking off the snow, the mother dog immediately rose, her eyes scanning him as if assessing his state. "I'm back," Jack said, his voice low and reassuring. He set the supplies down and crouched near her. "And look what I found." He pulled out a tin of meat he'd brought from the outpost, opening it and offering her a piece. She sniffed it cautiously before taking it from his hand, her eyes never leaving his. As the pup stirred and began to feed, Jack pulled out the journal again. He glanced at the mother dog, who now lay watching him with an almost human intensity. "Who are you?" he whispered. "And what brought you here?" The storm outside had calmed, but Jack knew the real tempest was just beginning. Somewhere out there was a mystery tied to these dogs, one he was determined to unravel. The morning light was faint, barely breaking through the overcast sky, and Jack stood by the window, staring out at the now still world. The snow had stopped falling, but the world remained blanketed in white, serene and untouched. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, casting flickering shadows against the walls of the cabin. The warmth was a stark contrast to the cold outside, and Jack took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. His thoughts, however, were anything but calm. The journal he'd discovered the previous day weighed heavily on his mind. Someone had been close to these dogs before him, and it wasn't just the faintest hint of a trail, there had been an active search. Who had been here, and why? Did they leave them? And most troubling of all, had they known something Jack didn't? As Jack prepared breakfast for the dogs, slicing up some leftover meat and mixing it with warm water for the pups, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The quiet in the cabin was no longer comforting, it was oppressive. His instincts, honed from years of firefighting, were on high alert. He placed the food down, watching as the pups eagerly licked at their bowls while the mother dog lay nearby, her eyes never leaving Jack for too long. She had become protective of him in a way that was impossible to ignore. Even now, as she ate, there was a vigilance to her movements, a watchful awareness that Jack understood. They were both on edge, both uncertain of what was happening or what would happen next. Suddenly, the quiet outside was pierced by a distinct sound, a crunching of snow underfoot. Jack's heart skipped, his body going tense. He wasn't expecting anyone. Not out here. Not in the middle of a storm-soaked wilderness. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle, and he crept toward the window, peering through the frosted glass. Through the haze of snow and wind, he could make out a lone figure approaching. A man, trudging slowly toward the cabin, his face obscured by the flurry of snowflakes. Jack's mind raced. Who could it be? And why would anyone be out here in these conditions? Without thinking, Jack opened the door cautiously, the cold air seeping in, biting at his skin. The figure stopped, clearly startled by the sudden appearance of someone at the cabin. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy winter coat and a rugged pair of boots, his face weathered and hardened from years in the wilderness. "Can I help you?" Jack's voice was firm, guarded, his grip on the rifle tightening just a fraction. The man hesitated, eyes flicking to the rifle before returning to Jack. He paused, as if unsure whether to explain. "I've been looking for my dogs." "Have you seen them?" Jack's eyes narrowed. His first instinct was to ask more questions, but something in the man's eyes told him he wasn't here to cause trouble. "Your dogs?" Jack asked, his voice softening. "What are their names?" The man's face seemed to tighten as he responded, his voice low and filled with an underlying frustration. "Max and Bella. German shepherds. One's got a scar above her eye. They've been missing for days. I tracked them here, but they were gone when I got close." The mention of Max and Bella struck a chord in Jack's chest. His mind raced. This was no coincidence. The mother dog, with her scarred face, matched the description. But what had happened to them before they arrived here? Why had they ended up in the middle of a blizzard? "I've seen them," Jack said slowly, watching the man carefully. He could see the flicker of relief in the stranger's eyes, but there was also something darker there, something Jack couldn't place. The man nodded, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Where are they?" he asked, his voice urgent. "I need to get them. They've been through too much already." Before Jack could respond, the mother dog's low growl broke the silence. She stood up, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the stranger at the door. Her reaction was immediate and protective, her hackles raised as she positioned herself in front of the pups. The change in her demeanor was stark, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. The stranger noticed the shift too. "She doesn't trust me," he said, a hint of concern in his voice. Jack didn't answer right away. He was watching the mother dog, the way she stood her ground without hesitation. Something wasn't adding up. If this man had been searching for them, why had he left them to fend for themselves in the first place? "Why didn't you stay with them?" Jack asked, his voice sharp. "You say you've been looking for them, but you didn't come back. Why leave them out here?" The man stiffened, his eyes flicking to the ground before meeting Jack's gaze again. He seemed to struggle with his words. "I couldn't find them. They were gone. They've been avoiding me, and I don't know why. But I won't leave them again." Jack felt the weight of the moment, the tension between them thick enough to cut. His gut told him there was more to this story. Something didn't add up. And now, with the dogs under his care, he couldn't let just anyone take them. Not without understanding the full truth. "You'll need to prove it," Jack said finally, his tone unwavering. "You'll have to tell me everything. And I'll decide whether or not to let you in." The man looked at Jack for a long moment, his gaze hardening. He was holding something back, and Jack could feel it. The storm outside may have stopped, but the real storm was just beginning. Over the next few days, Jack fortified the cabin, turning it into a defensive stronghold. Luna seemed to trust Ryan now, sensing his fear and desperation. Her protective instincts extended to him, though she remained fiercely loyal to Jack. The storm finally cleared, and Jack decided to head into town for supplies and to report what was happening. Ryan stayed behind with Luna and the pups, agreeing to keep the cabin secure. As Jack reached the edge of town, he noticed an unusual number of unfamiliar vehicles and people. Something wasn't right. He turned back, deciding it was too risky to be seen. When he returned to the cabin, he found the door ajar. Inside, Ryan was gone, and there were signs of a struggle. Luna stood near the pups, barking frantically. A chilling message was scrawled on the wall in red paint: "You can't hide him." The air was heavy with tension as Jack stepped back from the door, the rifle still held firmly in his hands. The man, standing on the threshold of the cabin, seemed hesitant but determined. His eyes flicked from Jack to the mother dog, still positioned protectively in front of her pups. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. The storm outside had faded into nothing more than a soft whisper of wind, but inside, the atmosphere crackled with 1,000 unspoken questions. Jack had always trusted his instincts, one of the reasons he had survived so many years in the fire service. And right now, every part of him screamed that this man, this stranger, was hiding something. The way he was acting, too eager, too desperate, didn't match the story he'd told. If he had really been looking for his dogs for days, why had he appeared now, just when Jack was beginning to piece together his own understanding of the situation? Why hadn't he been in the area before? "Tell me the truth," Jack said, his voice low and commanding. "Why didn't you stay with your dogs when you found them? Why didn't you take care of them if they were so important to you?" The man flinched, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. For a moment, he didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the cabin's interior, toward the warmth and the safety Jack had provided for the dogs. And then, finally, he spoke, his voice low, barely a whisper, as if he was reluctant to reveal what he knew. "Because I wasn't supposed to find them," he said, the words hanging in the air, thick with meaning. "I was told to leave them." Jack's brow furrowed, confusion swirling in his gut. "Told? By who?" The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if checking to see if anyone was listening, even though the storm outside had long since passed. I didn't have a choice, he continued, stepping closer into the cabin, his voice now more urgent. I was part of an experiment. A government program. The dogs, they're not just ordinary animals. They've been trained for something I didn't fully understand. Jack felt his pulse quicken, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process the man's words. What are you talking about? What kind of experiment? The man exhaled sharply, looking down at the snow-covered ground as if weighing whether or not to continue. They were bred for a purpose. Special missions. Rescue, search and recovery. They were going to be part of a program to train dogs for covert military operations. But something went wrong. They became too smart, too independent. And they started to remember things they weren't supposed to. The gravity of his words hit Jack like a physical blow. The mother dog, so strong, so fiercely protective of her pups, wasn't just an ordinary German shepherd. She was part of something much bigger, something darker. The pups, too, had likely inherited these traits. But the implications of what the man was saying were far beyond what Jack had ever imagined. Why bring them back here? Jack asked, his voice sharp, now feeling both a sense of urgency and betrayal. If they were part of some military project, why would you let them go? Why not finish what you started? The man's eyes darkened, and he stepped back, his hand running through his unkempt hair. Because they didn't belong there, he muttered, almost to himself. I realized too late what they were being trained for. I couldn't be part of it anymore. But when I tried to get them out, tried to get them away, they ran. They knew something was wrong. They knew they had to escape. Jack's heart was racing now. This wasn't just about a lost dog or a stray animal. It was about something far more complicated, something that felt like it was spiraling out of control. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Jack asked, his voice thick with disbelief. You've known where they were all this time, and now, only after I take them in, you show up. Why? The man looked up, his eyes filled with guilt. I couldn't risk it. I thought they were lost. And I didn't know if you would help. But now, seeing them here, I know I have to make things right. I just need to make sure they're safe. Jack stood frozen, processing the weight of the man's words. He glanced at the mother dog, who had moved closer, now standing silently by his side. Her gaze was unwavering, as if she understood the conversation unfolding around them. She wasn't just a survivor, she was part of something much more complex than Jack could have ever anticipated. The puppies, now playing together near the hearth, were blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. They were innocent, pure, but their very existence was tied to a dangerous secret. Jack had taken them in to protect them, to offer them refuge from the brutal world outside. But now, it seemed like the world was about to come knocking at his door, and with it, the full weight of their past. The man stepped forward again, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Look, I don't expect you to trust me. But I need your help. These dogs, they're not safe. Not with me, and not with anyone who was part of that program. You saw what they could do, didn't you? How the mother, she knows when something's wrong. She knows how to protect her pups. She's more than just an animal. She's been trained to survive, and she's done it well. Jack could feel the weight of the man's words sinking in. He had already known the mother dog was special, but now, with the knowledge that she was part of something much larger, the stakes had changed entirely. This wasn't just about keeping them safe from the storm, it was about keeping them safe from the people who had created them, and whatever other dark forces might be at play. Okay, Jack said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. But we do this on my terms. I need answers. No more half-truths. The man nodded, his face drawn tight with a mixture of relief and fear. You'll have them. but we don't have much time. There are people who will come looking for them. And when they do, they'll do whatever it takes to get them back." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. The dogs had led him into a situation he hadn't asked for, but now, there was no turning back. The real battle was just beginning. After escaping, Ryan revealed the final piece of the puzzle. The trafficking operation wasn't just a local issue, it was part of a larger network involving corrupt officials and wealthy elites. The group chasing him was desperate to silence him before he could expose them. Jack realized the gravity of the situation. His isolated life had been shattered, but he couldn't turn back now. He and Ryan devised a plan to reach federal authorities, despite the dangers. In a climactic showdown, Jack and Ryan managed to outsmart their pursuers, with Luna playing a crucial role in disarming one of the leaders. They reached safety, and Ryan's testimony led to a massive investigation and arrests. For Jack, the experience was transformative. His solitary existence had been disrupted, but he found a renewed sense of purpose. Luna and her pups became his permanent companions, a symbol of the unexpected bonds that saved him. In the end, Jack realized that the storm hadn't just brought danger, it had brought redemption, connection, and a chance to stand for something greater.